I am very happy to be joining George Steinmetz, who is the Charles Tilley Collegiate Professor of Sociology and Germanic Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan. George, thank you for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you, Dan, for inviting me.
Well, I think you and I have talked about this project a little bit in the past, but the idea here is it kind of begins in my experience as a philosopher of social science that it kind of seems like the social sciences need some profoundly new thinking, some innovative thinking. And it doesn't mean remaking the social sciences from the ground up, but it does mean not accepting some of the canards about what a good science is. And I know that that's an issue for you as well, and for example, in your book about positivism, or the collection about positivism. So I thought that a conversation with you, highlighting some of your thoughts about what's innovative in the social sciences now, what are the most promising avenues of inquiry, but also, as you mentioned a minute ago, the epistemology side. What constitutes a substantial piece of sociological knowledge? What is a good sociological explanation? I hope that in a couple minutes we'll be able to talk about causal mechanisms, causal realism, some of the thinking which has kind of disaggregated the social into smaller bits of analysis and smaller bits of social process in a way that doesn't look for a grand theory, but looks for kind of a sum of a number of different explanatory approaches. That's sort of the perspective that I'm taking in my thinking and work. But what I'm really interested in today, because I do regard your work as being genuinely innovative and boundary crossing. So I'm hoping to get a sense from you of what your best thinking is about the status of sociology today, where we should be going, what are some of the promising avenues. Comparison is certainly, or comparative work, which again has been important for you. That's certainly one of the things I'm interested in.
Okay. Well, some of the most promising avenues in sociology today, or in the social sciences today, or even more broadly in what I like to call the human sciences, because I like to not distinguish sharply between the so-called humanities and the so-called social sciences, and we can talk about that later in our discussion. But specifically in sociology, I think there are several areas in U.S.-based sociology that are emerging as, vibrant and exciting. And one of them that's been underway now for a good 25 or 30 years is what we call historical sociology. But historical sociology has gone through a number of different phases of development. And for the most part, these different phases, I think, can be distinguished in terms of their underlying methodological premises, or, as you pointed out earlier, epistemological premises, although they've also shifted in terms of their substantive focus of research. And one can summarize broadly without distracting from the fact that, of course, there's a great deal of diversity and within each generation and each period. But broadly speaking, I think you can say that in the 1920s and up through 1933 in Weimar Germany, the idea of a kind of a sociology that was rooted historically, possibly with primary archival research, but also connected to the idea that each historical period would have unique or at least highly specific constellations of mechanisms or variables or processes that gave rise to events, arose for the first time. And in fact, the phrase historical sociology was first coined, as you probably know, by Max Weber's brother Alfred Weber, who took over his role as the kind of eminence grise of the Heidelberg Institute for State and Social Sciences during the 1920s through 1933, and then picked that up again after World War II. He went into a kind of an inner exile during the Nazi period. But that kind of historicism that had been prevalent in German social sciences more generally in the 19th century was picked up by the new discipline of sociology, and gave rise to a number of works that we can see as the founding works of a specifically sociological approach to historical sociology. And I could signal perhaps Norbert Elias's nowadays well-known dissertation, which was published as The Civilizing Process, long after he finished it, because he was driven into exile by the Nazis coming to power. But Elias really came out of that Heidelberg milieu of Alfred Weber and Karl Mannheim and other younger students like Karl Mannheim who were developing a historicist version of sociology. Karl Mannheim's own work on ideology and utopia and his essays on historicism came out of that period as well. So that would be the first period. The question then is, what happened to this historical sociology after 1933? Well, about probably 3/4 of those German or Jewish German historical sociologists were driven into exile, and most of them came to the United States. But for peculiar reasons that I've been trying recently to figure out, their legacy of a specifically historical approach to sociology doesn't really seem to have taken root until much later, I would say until the 1970s. There are a variety of individual specific reasons that I won't go into now unless you're interested for the reason for their failure to transfer their intellectual legacy. But it was only in the 1960s and 70s, really starting with the work of Charles Tilly and his doctoral dissertation on the Vendée, which was published in 1964, that sociologists began seriously working in a historical way. Nonetheless, as people like Craig Calhoun, my good friend and colleague, or other people have pointed out, the 1980s saw a kind of a rollback of the historicist tendencies, the tendencies I like to call historicist, the attentiveness to historical context, the embeddedness of all historical explanation in an understanding of cultural meanings and meanings that were attributed by actors at the time to the mechanisms and the actions that they were involved in. And there was a brief period in which historical sociology, in the United States at least, was partly reconfigured around, I think, a kind of an imitation version of an imagined natural science, in which there was an attempt to replicate a kind of an experimental methodology in historical sociology, breaking down the process into one or two or three or a set of variables that recurred in constant conjunctions, producing a certain kind of historical event. Now, I started arguing against that, and others like Chuck Tilley, even before me, were arguing against that in the 1990s. And Charles Tilley's last 15 years were really dedicated in part to debunking and demoting the idea that historical sociology should seek things like a general theory of X, a general theory of revolutions, a general theory of state formation. And instead of that grand case comparison, as he called it, one should seek out contingent conjunctions of causal mechanisms, varying by historical context, giving rise to events that may or may not be completely comparable and identical. Revolutions may not all be the same, and they, above all, may not all be caused by the same set of mechanisms and events. And so this new form of historical sociology, I would like to call it historicist, because I think it rejoins forces with the kind of thinking that we already saw in the epistemological writings of Max Weber, just in the decade before World War I, where Weber, having read the Southwest School of Neo-Kantian philosophy in Germany, Rickert, Lask, and others, really came to the conclusion that sociology and the social sciences more generally should be not seeking general theories of events, but should be seeking, but should not negate the whole ambition of explanation either. They should try to combine interpretation and attentiveness to historical conjuncture with causal explanation. So in a sense, one can say this is a rejoining of the Weberian tradition of the early 20th century. Both Max Weber, who read Rickert and developed this historicist understanding of combining interpretation and explanation, and his younger brother Alfred, who really codified this notion of a historical sociology. Of course, Alfred Weber is much less well known in the English-speaking world, except as an economist nowadays. But it was really thanks to him that this idea of what he called Geschichtssoziologie, history sociology, as well as the notion of a cultural sociology, which is a term that I believe he also coined, Kultursoziologie. I think he's the first to have used that term in print. That those two are really the same thing, and that notion goes back to Alfred Weber. So we've come full circle, back to the beginning after wandering in the wilderness for many decades. So that's historical sociology.